Cinema has always had a fondness for the samurai, whether it's fun action films, dramas, or even love stories. Filmmakers had just followed these mythic characters for almost a century. And while the golden era of samurai films was during the 50s and 60s, mostly during the time of the legendary director Akira Kurosawa, many forget though that the genre still lives on even today. Hollywood has even embraced, or more like stolen, elements of the Japanese genre, and they've been doing this for decades. They did this with popular films like Kill Bill, The Wolverine, and more recently, The Mandalorian. They all feature some kind of homage to the way of the samurai. Video games have also started to take some cues, with Ghost of Tsushima and Trek to Yomi being the more recent examples. As a side note, so that I don't get hate in the comments, I want to say that samurai films have also borrowed from old westerns, and this happened before and after World War II. So it's not just Hollywood ripping them off, they kind of ripped each other off. Japanese films, especially Kurosawa, was very influenced by Western movies. And while the output of samurai films may have slowed down a bit in recent years, don't ever let anyone tell you that the quality of the movies aren't still being made, even to this year. While compiling this list, I was actually pretty surprised just by how many great films came out after the year 2001. And if you want to own or watch any of these movies, you could get all of them on SamuraiDVD.com. It's a great site, especially if you're into samurai films. They have pretty much anything. And for watching this video, you could use the code Bushido Blues at checkout. That way you get yourself a nice discount. So anyway, here is my list of top 10 samurai films of the 21st century. So finally, I had the pleasure to see Blade of the Immortal after years of hearing about it. And I really gotta admit that I feel really stupid just for taking so long to finally watch this film. And I'm even like the biggest Takashi Miike fan, so I really had no excuse. And what I found is, like with Rurouni Kenshin, the live action series, this is just a great example of how you do a manga to live action adaptation. And it's just a really great film with a fun concept and just tons of great fighting and nice blood and gore. I've also been meaning to finally read this manga for a while now. I heard great things about it. And after seeing this movie, I think I'm finally gonna give it a shot. This story is just such a great concept. And the film does a really great job of making you think of topics like death and immortality. It gets into some of the deeper meanings behind that. And what's pretty cool too is it shows the downside to being immortal, stuff you don't really think about. And it's capable of taking this main character that's practically invincible and just doing a great job at still making him seem like he's vulnerable. I was wondering how they were going to do that, because usually invincible characters are kind of boring because nothing could really happen to them. But I got to say, I was very impressed by this film, and once again, Miike, you just always outdo my expectations. Buragaki just does an exceptional job in showing what it was like firsthand to be a member of the Shinsengumi. And it even gets into some of the bad things they've done. It doesn't paint them as this like perfect picture. It focuses mainly on the historical person of the second in command of the Shinsengumi. And what's cool too is there's actual pictures of him, so you can kind of see how similar he looked. And what the film does greatly is it shows his life before and just how it was affected by the Shinsengumi in that time period. And then it shows how it comes to an end. It's jam-packed with tons of history, so I'm going to say go in knowing some of the history and be prepared to be a little educated by this film. And I gotta say, the fight scenes in this are just exceptional. It's just a very new and polished looking film. You could tell they put a lot of money into the budget. It's great cinematography, great epic battles, large scale battle scenes. And honestly, the more I think about this film, the more I like it. So I think over time it's going to move up on this list. But just know that this is a great new film. It came out a year ago, and just recently we got it, just a month ago in the States. So be sure to check it out. So the Rurouni Kenshin live action series was really just a game changer for me. Before this series, I really didn't see any good anime to live action anime adaptations done well. Usually they have stupid looking costumes and hairdos and bunch of flips and unrealistic stuff. But this series, and especially the final film, The Beginning, just does a great job at showing more of the realistic approach to anime. Rurouni Kenshin The Beginning is actually the last film in the series, and I feel like with this one they finally had practice and they just got it right. They just nailed the tone and just the look of the film. It's completely different from the rest of the series. It has a much darker and bleaker feel to it, and it fits with the story. There's no fake high jumps or superpowers or any of that stupid stuff. It's just brutal sword fighting at its best, and it looks and feels great and realistic. This film is a prequel, so you can watch it before seeing any of the other films in the series, so that's an added bonus. And it's also on Netflix, so you can get it pretty easily. Check it out. When the Last Sword is Drawn is really just an epic film. By the time it's over, you feel like you've lived through something very emotional with a lot of weight behind it. Just like Buragaki, this is another film covering the Shinsengumi. It's a topic to me that's always interesting. Actually, they were also in Rurouni Kenshin The Beginning. I gotta say, the main character in this just makes the film so much more enjoyable. He's kinda goofy, he's funny, he's kinda cheap, and even though he's a bit money driven, it's kinda used as a gag by the other members just to kinda laugh at him and roast him. But deep down, he's a man that loves life. And that's odd for a samurai. In that way, this film could be sort of a metaphor for the kamikaze pilots of World War II. It's an examination of just how far the good will go to protect those that they love. It's a really emotional film, it has great production value, it looks great, and it's a film for those that want their samurai films to be tearjerkers. Don't miss it. The original Unforgiven, starring Clint Eastwood, is amongst the greatest westerns of all time. It featured legendary actors like Morgan Freeman and just an older but still badass Clint Eastwood. You couldn't possibly think that you can remake such a classic, but this isn't necessarily a remake, but instead a different version. But instead of cowboys, it's samurai. And instead of Clint Eastwood, it's Ken Watanabe. He's basically the Japanese equivalent. It also takes place in Japan's beautiful Hokkaido province. It's a place that doesn't look like anywhere else. And it's just really interesting to look at, and I wish more films were filmed here. And I found all the characters to be pretty great in this, especially the villain. He's a very dislikable guy. That's how they should be. And I'm gonna say, I actually prefer the ending in this version. Goes down a little differently. I like both versions, but this one I prefer a little bit more. Anyway, I recommend seeing both films, both the original and just this excellent Japanese remake with samurai. This film simply isn't talked about enough. Please watch it. This is another film by the legendary Takashi Miike. As you know, I like his films a lot, and this time it's the remake of the 1963 classic 13 Assassins. I feel like everyone's probably seen this film. It's very well known, everyone always mentions it, but there's a good reason why. The plot follows 12 samurai and a hunter, and they all come together to plot the assassination of a murderous lord who's a psychopath, and they do this before he ascends to a higher seat of power. So, I originally saw this movie when it first came out, and I'm gonna say after I viewed it again recently for this ranking video, I at first really wasn't viewing this right. I kind of just took it as a really good bloody action film directed by Takashi Miike, but really it's a lot more than that. This is how you make a remake, and I just really like what Miike did with this film. He took the original and he made it into a much better film. I like the original, but I feel like this does a lot of things better. The villain, for instance, is a hell of a lot more memorable. He does a lot of bad things in this that he didn't do in the original. He's really just such a bastard that you want to see him killed. I also feel like the 13 main characters in this have a lot more personality to them. And I also really like the hunter guy that they meet up with. He's kind of like a Kikuchiyo from Seven Samurai. I always enjoy those kind of fun, goofy characters like that. What it sacrifices from the original, I'm going to say, is it kind of just gets rid of most of the planning that was involved with the big ambush. And instead of all that planning, he gives us more of a payoff. The fight in this is 45 minutes long of just pure blood and gore action. But it's really not all this film has to offer, which I originally thought. There's plenty of dramatic moments that I didn't notice the first time, especially with the main characters, and it really does pay off in the end. Lots of emotion. You really feel something, and that's what makes it feel more alive than the original. I love this film, and I can see why everyone else does too. The Sword of Desperation is really just a surprise hit for me, and it's one that I recently just watched for the first time, and I wish I watched it sooner because it's great. It's a Shuhei Fujisawa adaptation, and you'll see a lot of that on this list, but this is a damn good one. It starts off with a bang, and it just slowly builds like a mystery and then just hits you in the end with an amazing twist ending. It also features some of the best sword fights I've ever seen. It's a bit of a slower pace in the middle, but don't give up because the ending is what makes this film. Please watch it. Perhaps the biggest face in all of samurai cinema has to be Tatsuya Nakadai. It's almost essential for him to be included in every top 10 list. And just seeing him again at the age of 90 and he's still doing what he always did and he's doing what he loves and is known for, it's just powerful beyond the film itself. Here we're looking at a legend. And I've noticed that he has been active in films, but they were smaller roles. But finally, he did return as the lead in the samurai film in 2015 with A Duel's Tale, and then again in 2019 with The Return. And he really does return to this in true form. He plays a bit of a anti-hero in this. In this film, he plays a aged Yakuza, and he's dying of a terminal illness, and he returns to his hometown after 30 years. And now he's gonna finish some business that was left unfinished. This film is emotional, it's dramatic, and above all else, it's very powerful. Especially if you grew up watching films of his when he was much younger. This is really Tatsuya Nakadai's Unforgiven. And it's not only one of the best films of the 21st century, but among Nakadai's best films of all time. And that's not easy considering he's been in hundreds of films, including classics like Harakiri, Ran, Kagemusha. If this is his last film that he ever does, I think I'll be okay with that. In fact, I think this being his swan song would be perfect. Don't miss it. At River's Edge is a film I talk a lot about, especially in my rankings. It is another Shuhei Fujisawa adaptation, and I gotta admit, I just really love this film. I don't know if it's just me because no one else really talks about it, so I did end up rewatching it again, especially before doing this ranking, and I gotta say I love it even more. This is actually my favorite film on this list, but it's not number one, and that's only because I felt that a different one would be more suitable. But eventually, one of these days, At River's Edge is going to become number one on the list, and it deserves it. This film is simply amazing, and it's especially just how I like my samurai films. It's on the slower side, keeps you invested, has beautiful, beautiful scenery, beautiful music and flashbacks. I also really love the acting, especially the main lead. He's just so cool, he's stoic, and he does what he has to do. He's the blueprint of what a samurai should be. And I also like how he's smart and he's just able to piece together what other characters are thinking. In the scene, he states that being a samurai is hard. And that's really what this film is about. Sometimes you have to do something that's very difficult. Sometimes you have to put loved ones aside and you have to do what has to be done. His interactions with his sister is especially emotional. He acts like an older brother would, and it feels real. And the premise of the story is just so good and exciting. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I will say that a very skilled samurai has to make a really difficult choice to kill his best friend, who's also skilled with the sword. And it also involves going against his sister, who has the same training as him. And to top it off, his partner that's with him might be in love with her. It shows that sometimes being good at fighting can be a disadvantage. It really is such a powerful film. I don't know if it's just me, but I love this film.
What does it mean to be samurai? To devote yourself utterly to a set of moral principles, to seek a stillness of your mind, and to master the way of the sword.
To know life in every breath, every cup of tea, every life we take.
So this might be cheating, but I'm picking all three samurai films in the Yoji Yamada unofficial samurai trilogy for my number one. And I've decided to do this because I feel like all three of these films deal with a very similar theme, and they all take place in the same time period, which is right before the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. And I feel like that's indeed a really interesting time period in Japanese history, and these films just show it so well. For those of you who think of Kurosawa's samurai films as being genre-defying, you're likely going to be surprised by Yoji Yamada's approach. He sees men not mainly as warriors like Kurosawa, but more so as court functionaries in a feudal system that was about to go through some great changes. The main characters in all three of these films are poor in one way or another, but they all find a way in the end of each one of these films just to redeem their honor, and usually it's in the display of swordsmanship. And this is usually against the feudal forces of oppression. It shows that how, even if you're poor and stuck in a rut, there can still be greatness within you. And that's just a great message. Yamada usually tries to make some references in each of his films about the disaffection that man has with society. He also has a lot of his films dealing with class, and we especially see that in these films. What I love about this trilogy though is its realism. There's sword fights, but they aren't flashy. Yet, somehow, each of them is very memorable. He shows how you could do a lot with less. Yamada once said in an interview that he was disappointed in the period films that he saw regarding samurai, and he wanted to produce something that was more realistic, especially with the fight scenes. He said that the fight scenes in most of these period films about samurai were simply not believable. So the first film in this trilogy is the 2002 The Twilight Samurai, and this is by far his most popular film. Everyone always seems to mention this film on any lists, and it's also the movie with the most awards. The name The Twilight Samurai has a double meaning. For one, the protagonist of the story is Sabai Uguchi, and he's been given the nickname Twilight by his fellow samurai since he goes straight home at sunset to look after his two young daughters, or to work in his fields rather than join them for drinks. And they make fun of him for that. Nice friends. Twilight also describes the time period in which this film takes place, which was immediately before the Meiji Restoration. And during this time, it's kind of like the sunset of samurai since it was the end of their power. Next is the 2004 movie The Hidden Blade, and like with the other film's protagonist, he's a bit of an anti-hero. The protagonist in this is a low-level functionary who spends much of his time learning how to use the newly imported British cannons. His master plans to use these weapons against his enemies. And like with the film The Last Samurai, the samurai in this film hate being forced to use these foreign weapons like guns, and they were very vocal about their preference for the traditional sword and bow. Love and Honor released in 2006, and this is the final film in the trilogy. It's also my personal favorite. Like with the Twilight Samurai and the Hidden Blade, this is also a love story in which a low-level samurai struggles against circumstances to both please his heart and his conscience. This time the main character is a food taster, and he develops blindness after eating a bad meal that was intended for his clan's lord. And instead of getting disability pay, he's faced with a loss of his salary. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also has these really jerky relatives that are secretly pushing his loving wife into the arms of a wealthy samurai. And part of this has to do with his wealth being a benefit to them. And this film also ends with one of the best final fights I've ever seen. In fact, all three of these films end with just an amazing final fight. So these three films are just so good that I just can't separate them. They go together perfectly as an anthology, and that's kind of how I view them. This really wasn't an easy list, mainly because there's just so many great films from this time period, and there were so many others I wanted to include. It really pained me not being able to put The Last Samurai on here. I have talked about that one, and it is a favorite of mine. But I really hope that this list just changes your mind about modern samurai films. Hopefully now you won't just think that samurai films are only good during the old school Kurosawa days. There's plenty of great films that we're still getting, even to this year. Anyway, if you would like to add any more, please feel free to leave a comment. I'd appreciate seeing what your top 10 is. I'd also like to thank everyone that saw my original post about this video, and especially those that commented. That really helped a lot with this list. I'd especially like to thank Jay Tilton and the Nerdy Ronin. You guys are awesome. Anyway, thanks for watching the entire video. I really appreciate that. I know that's not always easy. And if you want to help support my channel, you could check out my Patreon. I just added some nice new tiers. I'll probably add more rewards to them. Also, if you want to own any of these films, then you can get them on SamuraiDVD.com. Use the code BushitoBlues at checkout for a discount. And like always, thanks for watching.